The weight of the crimes and horrors perpetrated by the Nazis was profoundly heavy for the surviving members of their families. Among them, the one who bore the greatest burden was a small, timid Austrian woman, the closest living relative of Adolf Hitler, the architect of the Nazi terror. This woman was Paula Hitler, Adolf's only full sister. Another sister and 3 brothers had died in childhood. Growing up in these conditions, Paula and Adolf shared a special bond, which lasted until Adolf left home to pursue his own path. Paula went on to lead her own life, receiving commercial training and working as a clerk for the Austrian state insurance company in Vienna during the 1920s. In 1930, she reportedly lost her job due to her brother's notoriety. Adolf then began providing her financial support, initially giving her 250 shillings per month, later increasing this to 500 Reichsmarks. During the war, Adolf insisted that Paula remain out of the public eye, even suggesting she adopt the surname Wolf, a nickname he had used in the 1920s. Thus, Paula lived much of the war in Vienna under this assumed identity, with no one around her aware of her family connection. On April 14, 1945, 2 SS officers escorted her to Berchtesgaden, where she was granted 100,000 Reichsmarks by Adolf's orders, the same amount allocated to her half-sister Angela. After the war, Paula was briefly detained by American forces and interrogated by the Counterintelligence Corps on May 26, 1945, but she was soon released. She returned to Vienna and worked in an arts and crafts shop for 7 years. On December 1, 1952, Paula relocated to Berchtesgaden to pursue claims from Adolf Hitler's personal will. The process was complicated by the absence of an official death certificate for Hitler. On October 2, 1948, a Munich tribunal identified Hitler as a principal offender and seized his property, including a Munich house, several homes near Berchtesgaden, and a claim worth approximately 5 million marks against a publishing firm. The court ultimately denied Paula's claim to the inheritance outlined in Hitler's will. Confusion over jurisdiction between courts in Berchtesgaden and Berlin further delayed the proceedings. The federal court in Berchtesgaden took control, and Judge Dr. Heinrich Stephanos began hearings in late 1952, which continued until early 1956. Over this time, 42 witnesses testified, including 13 who had only recently returned from Russian POW camps. Despite these obstacles, Paula continued her efforts quietly, avoiding public attention. She passed away on June 1, 1960, in Schaul, near Berchtesgaden at age 64. 5 months later, the court issued a certificate of inheritance granting her 2/3 of Hitler's estate. Though Paula was Adolf Hitler's sister, she was not responsible for his crimes. In contrast, another woman directly involved with Nazi leadership chose to align herself with the regime's evil. Margaret Himmler, wife of Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS. Born Margaret Boden into a wealthy landowning family, she served as a nurse in the German Red Cross during World War I, an experience that left her with a sense of loss and a pessimistic outlook. After a brief marriage that ended in divorce, she purchased a private clinic in Berlin with her father's support. In 1927, she met Heinrich Himmler on a train from Munich to Berlin. 8 years her junior, Himmler shared Margaret's interest in alternative medicine, partly due to his chronic stomach issues. Their courtship included daily letters and a 3-day intimate stay in a Bavarian town before Christmas, after which they married on July 3, 1928, in a Berlin registry office, with Margaret's father and brother as witnesses. Himmler's devout Catholic parents struggled to accept the union and did not attend. The couple had a daughter, Gudrun, in 1929, and maintained a strict, structured household according to Himmler's ideals, though their marriage faced challenges due to his frequent absences and infidelities. Had an affair with his secretary Hedwig, something that deeply affected Margaret, although not so significant. Margaret did have a role of her own in Nazi Germany. She was involved with the German Red Cross and supervised various facilities during the war. She accompanied Himmler at official events but was not part of the inner social circles of the Nazi elite. She did, however, support her husband's political activities and was known for her anti-Semitic views. After World War II ended, Margaret and her daughter Gudrun were detained by Allied forces, being the wife of the second most powerful man in Nazi Germany. Margaret had to go through several denazification trials. These trials aimed to purge German society of Nazi ideology and hold individuals accountable for their involvement. With the Nazi regime, the process included classifying individuals into categories such as major offenders, lesser offenders, followers, and exonerated persons, with corresponding penalties ranging from execution and imprisonment to fines and restrictions on employment. Initially classified as a major offender, Margaret's status changed several times. Throughout these trials, she argued for her release by claiming she had only been a nurse and was never involved in her husband's crimes. Despite these claims, Margaret struggled to defend her past actions and associations. The trials were a source of immense stress and uncertainty for Margaret. In the end, the court finally classified her as Category 4 MIT Lehrerin, the follower, as such. She was not held responsible for her husband's actions, but was still sentenced to 30 days punitive work. She also lost her pension rights and the right to vote. Following her release, Margaret lived with her sister in Hepen but then moved to live with her daughter to Gudrun in Munich. The two lived in a small apartment, a stark contrast to the comfort Margaret enjoyed in Nazi Germany. She also faced significant financial difficulties as she battled for pensions she believed were owed to her. The post-war period was indeed challenging for Margaret, as she had to adjust to a new reality where she was no longer part of the ruling elite. The loss of status and wealth weighed heavily on Margaret's personal life was also on a downfall. Her relationship with her daughter Gudrun became increasingly strained. Gudrun, who had idolized her father, found it hard to accept the new circumstances she became, involved with neo-Nazi groups trying to uphold her father's legacy. Margaret disapproved of Gudrun's associations with neo-Nazi elements, and this involvement caused tension between them. Unlike her daughter, Margaret was trying to live a low-profile life throughout her post-war life. Margaret remained largely out of the public eye. She continued to face financial hardships and health issues, bearing the stigma of her husband's actions and her own involvement in the Nazi regime. Margaret's attempts to secure financial support were most often met with bureaucratic obstacles. The difficult years of navigating a new challenging reality left a profound impact on Margaret, shaping her final years in ways she had never anticipated during her time as the wife of Heinrich Himmler. She died on August 25, 1967 at the age of 73. As a bitter, exhausted, and utterly frustrated woman, Margaret's post-war life was a total contrast to the life of her daughter Gudrun. Gudrun Himmler, born in 1929, grew up in a structured environment, reflecting her father's strict ideals. Her father being a key figure in Hitler's regime deeply influenced her upbringing. Himmler, rarely at home, tried to make his Gudrun a model daughter. He preached decency, good manners, obedience, and diligence in school. He sent her postcards with SS symbols and SS newsletters to read Gudrun. The good Nazi girl wrote letters to the front, made gifts for SS soldiers, and joined the Bund Dota Medal at 10. She also wrote to her father almost daily with longing letters. The daughter missed her traveling puppy. She had no idea what kind of persons her father truly was. However, as the war was nearing its end, this was about to change. When the fall of Nazi Germany became a matter of days, Himmler ordered his staff to organize an escape for his family. On April 19, 1945. One of his closest associates took Margaret and Ganto South Tyrol, where we are going, must remain a secret under a false name, she wrote in her diary. However, on May 13, American soldiers arrested Gudrun and her mother and took them to an internment camp in Italy 10 days later. Gudrun learned that their beloved father had poisoned himself in British capture captivity, After a year and a half of living in harsh conditions of internment camps, Göring and her mother were released in late 1946. The two of them found refuge in the bottling institutions founded by an evangelical pastor in Bethel. Göring learned tailoring there. This period was extremely challenging for Göring, who had idolized her father and struggled to come to terms with the new reality. In 1952, she moved to Munich trying to find a J, but her father's name often stood in her way. Nevertheless, proud of being her father's daughter, she continued to call herself Rudolf Himmler until she married Da Bitz, a functionary in the Bavarian branch of the National Democratic Party of Germany, a political organization scrutinized for its extremist positions and historical connections to neo-Nazi ideology. Unlike her mother, Göring was determined to uphold her father's legacy and refused to renounce his actions or beliefs. Göring's involvement with neo-Nazi groups became a significant part of her post-war life. She worked to maintain the memory of prominent Nazis and supported former SS members and their families by being active in organizations that provided aid to these individuals. She showed her continued loyalty to her father's ideals. One of the organizations in which Göring was most active was the notorious Still Heiler, or the Silent Help, was founded in 1951 to assist war convicts, a euphemism for war criminals for old comrades. Silent Help collected money, smuggled messages into prisons, and lobbied politicians for clemency. Releases. The association used dubious channels, as well as the services of prominent Christian Democratic Union and Christian Social Union representatives like Franz Josef Strauss and Alfred Dreger. The Catholic Church also apparently got involved when asked who had helped him escape after the war criminal. Joseph Schwamberger laconically replied, the Pope. This obviously Nazi organization was recognized as a charitable organization until 1998. However, a far more controversial fact was that Göring worked as a secretary at BNDD, the Federal Intelligence Service of Germany headquarters, in Pullach near Munich, from 1961 to 1963. At that time, the organization was under the control of Reinhard Golan, a former Nazi military intelligence commander. Göring continued to be involved in neo-Nazi activities and over time became a prominent figure. In far-right circles, Göring's activities went well beyond helping the old comrades and included organizing reunions of SS veterans and participating in events that commemorated the Nazi era. She used her position and connections to advocate for the rights of former SS members, often speaking out against the treatment they received after the war. Göring's unwavering support for her father and his ideals made her a controversial figure. She faced criticism and scrutiny from those who viewed her actions as an attempt to glorify a dark chapter in history. Despite this, Göring remained steadfast in her beliefs and continued her activism. Until her later years, the relationship between Göring and Margaret remained strained throughout their lives, while Göring was vocal and active in her support for the Nazi legacy. Margaret sought to move away from that part of her life. This fundamental difference in their approaches to their past created a rift that was never fully healed. Göring Himmler died on May 24, 2018, at her home near Munich, at the age of 88. As a free citizen of Germany, something her father denied to millions, she was a fervent Nazi. Till her last breath, another of Heima's close relatives, who was forced to cope with his troublesome past after the war, was his older brother Gebhard. Although he did not have as prominent a role as Heinrich, Gebhard was involved in the Nazi regime's activities and shared most of the nationalist and racist views of his famous brother. During the Nazi era, Gebhard worked in various roles, including various administrative positions, of which the most important was the position of the Department A director within the Reich Ministry of Science, Education, and Culture, as World War II came to an end. Gebhard, like many others associated with the Nazi leadership, including his brother, tried to avoid capture by the Allied forces when the war was drawing to a close. He took refuge at his brother-in-law's clinic in Hohen, Lean, it was the place, set up by Heinrich Himmler, a temporary haven for Gebhard and his family as the Allied forces closed in. Heinrich provided a car to help Gebhard's family flee to Schleswig-Holstein. Gebhard hoped that being in this area under British control would offer better chances for leniency than falling into the hands of the Soviets. Despite trying to slip through the hands of the Allied soldiers, Gard was ultimately captured according to denazification categories. Gebhard was placed in the second highest category and labeled an offender. The following 3 years, Gebhard spent in several internment camps. Surprisingly, despite being interned, he maintained a degree of optimism. He organized activities within the camps, including a Christmas party for Bavarian prisoners, and documented his experiences through poetry and sketches. His internment ended when he was transferred to the Ustasa camp in Munich, where he was finally released in July 1948. Post-war life for Gebhard seemed to have been more difficult than the one in internment camp due to his family background and his association with the Nazi regime. He struggled to reintegrate into society. He took a low-paying job in a factory, making condensers a far more humble engagement than his previous roles. Despite a troublesome background, Gebhard continued to seek ways to restore his professional status. In the early 1950s, he found a position at the European Afghan Cultural Institute, where he was engaged in organizing training places for Afghan students. This job allowed him to reconnect with his past professional contacts, though it did not provide the financial stability he desired during that same period. Gebhard fought to restore his pension rights and professional reputation. It took him years of persistent effort to regain his pension. Finally, in 1959, his pension rights were restored, allowing him to enjoy a modest improvement in his quality of life. He and his wife began to have annual travels to Italy, a small luxury that marked a return to some semblance of normalcy throughout his post-war life. Gard attempted to defend his and his brother's actions during the Nazi era, he gave interviews, and wrote notes portraying Heinrich Himmler as a man burdened by his duties rather than a willing perpetrator of horrible atrocities. In his writings and statements, Gebhard often sought to downplay the extent of their involvement in the regime's crimes. He described Heinrich as a dangerous romantic who was misled by his loyalty to Hitler. Gebhard also meticulously documented his family's history, creating chronological albums and arranging family documents. He avoided direct discussion of Hitler in his memory memoirs, attempting to present his life as one of a patriotic civil servant who had been unfairly punished after the war. This portrayal was part of his broader effort to distance himself from the full implications of the Nazi regime's actions. Gebhard remained in contact with other family members, including Heinrich's daughter Gudrun, whom he supported as much as possible. In the post-war years, he died in Munich on June 22, 1982. The family of the Reiches, Marshall. The fate of the princesses. For many of the Nazi leaders' closest persons, it was hard to distance from these persons. No matter how horrifying were things, they did. Such was the case with Emmy Göring, the wife of Hermann Göring, the commander of the Luftwaffe, and one of Hitler's closest associates. Emmy was famous in Germany for her career as an actress even before her marriage. However, after she married Hermann, her publicity skyrocketed. She was under constant public attention and was always photographed due to his charm and sociability. She served as a hostess at many state ceremonies before the outbreak of the Second World War. This role earned her the unofficial title of the First Lady of the Third Reich after World War II. Emmy Göring's popularity went on a downfall. She was put through the denazification process, accused of benefiting from her husband's position and of being complicit in the Nazi regime's crimes. During her trial, Emmy defended herself by stating that she had always acted out of love for her husband and had not engaged in any criminal activities. She also highlighted her efforts to help Jews and other persecuted individuals during the war. Several witnesses, including Jewish survivors, testified in her favor acknowledging her help during those difficult times. Despite the testimonies in her favor, Emmy was not spared from taking the consequences of her association with the Nazi regime. Emmy's trial before the Densification Tribunal took place on July 20, 1948. She faced the proceedings calmly confident that her actions during the war would speak for themselves. Indeed, testimonies of her colleagues from the theater and the Jews she helped underscored the complexity of Emmy's character and her attempts to navigate the moral challenges of her time. Nevertheless, the court sentenced her to a year in prison and prohibited her from performing on stage for 5 years. After her release, Emmy and her daughter Ada relocated to Munich, attempting to rebuild their lives while carrying the heavy weight of their past. In her memoir, My Life with Göring, Emmy reflected on her experiences with resilience, acknowledging both moments of joy and deep sorrow that had shaped her life. She described her marriage to Hermann Göring as a blessing and highlighted the significance of her daughter, Ida, in giving her life purpose and meaning. Despite the difficulties she faced after the war, Emmy remained thankful for the experiences that had shaped her, believing that human suffering and hardship could enrich life if not allowed to dominate it. The remainder of her life involved coping with the consequences of her connection to the Nazi regime, while striving to provide a stable, nurturing environment for her daughter. Ada Göring, a public figure in Nazi Germany, had been celebrated as both her father's favorite and the goddaughter of Adolf Hitler. Her birthdays were lavishly celebrated, often accompanied by aerial displays organized by her father. However, her life changed dramatically at the end of World War II. In June 1945, American forces moved Ada, Emmy, and other family members to Weldenstein Castle. Though the surroundings were luxurious, the family's situation was precarious, as they had to relinquish all valuables. While Emmy was imprisoned, 7-year-old Ida was placed in a convalescent home at Neuhaus, where Catholic sisters taught her basic reading, writing, and arithmetic skills. By 1948, Emmy secured Ida's admission to secondary school, despite lacking previous academic records. Throughout her school years, Ada excelled, earning high marks, participating actively in extracurricular activities, and winning the favor of teachers and peers. Her father's name was rarely mentioned, and political topics were strictly avoided. After Emmy's release, Ada joined her in a modest Munich apartment. She initially pursued law but switched to work as a medical technical assistant in a Munich hospital, finding the field more suited to her. Despite her notorious surname, Ada reported rarely facing major obstacles, and even sometimes benefited from her family name, such as during a trip to Spain, where she received preferential treatment. Ida never married, and lived in Munich surrounded by photographs and paintings of her parents, her apartment resembling a museum of her family. She maintained a strong emotional connection with her father, expressing admiration and fond memories of her childhood while also acknowledging the horrors of the Nazi regime without feeling personally responsible. Unlike some children of Nazi leaders who distanced themselves from their parents' legacies, Ada remained loyal to her father, which shaped her identity but kept her separated from broader societal reconciliation. She passed away in Munich on December 21, 2018, at the age of 80. Similarly, other women connected to the Nazi hierarchy, like Lena Heydrich, remained unwaveringly loyal to their husbands' legacies. Lena, the widow of Reinhard Heydrich, a chief architect of the Holocaust, never denounced her husband, despite his central role in the genocide. After his assassination by the Czech resistance in 1942, Lena enjoyed privileges as the widow of a high-ranking Nazi official and lived on her estate in Bohemia, where she reportedly oversaw forced labor and mistreatment of prisoners. After the war, she was briefly interned by the British but later released. In 1947, a Czech court sentenced her to life with 20 years of hard labor, but she avoided extradition and faced a denazification trial in Germany in 1949. Classified as a minor offender, she retained her property and lived freely, converting her family villa into a guest house for former SS members and their families. Lena continued to defend her husband's legacy, giving selective interviews and publishing her memoir, My Life with a War Criminal, in 1976, portraying him in a favorable light and downplaying his role in the Holocaust. She maintained close ties with her children and successfully pursued a pension as the widow of a German general. Lena died on August 14, 1985, at the age of 74, having devoted her life to preserving her husband's memory. Another woman who remained fiercely loyal to her Nazi spouse was Ilse Hess. Born into a privileged Berlin family, Ilse grew up with interests in music, literature, and outdoor pursuits. She met Rudolf Hess in 1920, a decorated war veteran, and quickly became involved in the Nazi movement, supporting him as secretary and activist. She married Hess in 1927, adhering to Nazi restrictions on female political participation, but leveraging her proximity to Hitler for influence. After Hess's capture during his flight to Scotland in 1941, Ilse remained devoted, maintaining communication through letters and supporting him during his imprisonment. Following the war, Hess was sentenced to life at Nuremberg and sent to Spandau prison. Ilse tirelessly worked for his release, opening a guest house in the Bavarian Alps, preserving a room for him, and publishing collections of correspondence. She campaigned internationally for his freedom, forming the Freedom for Rudolf Hess association and gathering tens of thousands of signatures, though Soviet authorities refused to release him. Despite Hess's deteriorating health, Ilse never abandoned her cause, visiting him in Spandau and maintaining her devotion to him and the Nazi ideology, and trying to maintain a semblance of normalcy during their brief meetings apart from Rudolf. Ilse maintained her loyalty to Hitler and the Nazi ideology in her letters. She expressed her happiness that he remained loyal to Hitler and that nothing had changed in her inward relationship to the man with whose destiny we have been so closely linked. In joy and suffering for more than 20 years, because of such her stance, Ilse faced social ostracism and financial difficulties. Ilse's financial situation worsened with limited means of support. She relied on the help of friends and sympathizers from the old Nazi network. The stigma of being associated with a high-ranking Nazi official followed her wherever she went, but she remained steadfast in her beliefs. She lived in modest accommodations, often moving to avoid harassment. Ilse visited Hess whenever possible. Maintaining a steady stream of letters to him, her visits were a lifeline for Rudolf, who spent decades in solitary confinement. Her health deteriorated, but her determination to support her husband never waned. In the 1970s, Ilse's health further declined. She suffered from various ailments, but continued to campaign for her husband's release. The burden of her efforts was heavy, but she pressed on. Driven by a deep sense of duty and loyalty, Ilse's tireless advocacy took a toll on her health, and she eventually took a back seat, allowing her son Wolf to continue the campaign. Rudolf Hess's death in 1987 was a devastating blow to Ilse. She was denied the opportunity to be with him in his final moments, which added to her grief. This, however, didn't stop her from being a fervent Nazi until the end of her life in 1995. Unlike Ilse, her son Wolf Rudiger, Hess never really had the chance to meet his father. He was only 3 years old when Rudolf flew to Scotland on a solo mission, an event that led to his imprisonment and lifelong separation from his family. Therefore, Wolf Rudiger's childhood was marked by the absence of his father. He grew up with letters from Rudolf. These letters were his main connection to his father, who refused to receive visitors under what he considered undignified circumstances. As a result, Wolf Rudiger never truly knew his father and only had photos and letters to form an image of him. During his youth, Wolf Rudiger had to navigate the complex emotion and societal reactions to his father's legacy. When he traveled with his mother to Nuremberg in 1946 to see his father during the trials, he was just a boy clutching a letter from his father. He did not understand the full weight of his father's actions but felt the impact of societal judgment. Despite this burden that truly bothered him, Wolf Rudiger strived to lead a normal life. He studied architecture and 1961 qualified as an architect, but the obstacles were many in 1959. Wolf Rudiger faced probably the most significant challenge when he was called up for military service during his medical examination at the district recruitment office in Munich. He declared his refusal to serve. This declaration required him to provide detailed reasons for his objection to the Conscientious Objector Review Board. Hess explained that his father was Rudolf Hess, imprisoned in Spandau, and that he could not serve a military judged by the same alliance that had condemned his father. Wolf Rudiger's refusal to serve in the military was a significant stance reflecting his deep moral convictions and the complexities of his father's legacy. He was a young man trying to navigate a world that judged him for his father's actions, while also trying to uphold his principles. Living in Munich, Wolf Rudiger continued to face challenges related to his father's legacy. He worked towards building his own life, separate from the infamous actions of Rudolf Hess, yet the constant reminder of his father's role in Nazi Germany was a burden he had to carry until the end of his life. In 1987, Rudolf suffered one final strike. His father was found dead in the prison garden house, hanged by an extension cord over a window latch. He was buried in a secret location, but the family managed to persuade the authorities to move his body to the family plot. Wolf Rudiger simply couldn't cope with his father's destiny. He couldn't believe he committed suicide and accused the British Secret Intelligence Service of his death for the remaining of his life. Wolf Rudiger committed to defending the legacy of his father, about whom he wrote 3 books. My Father, Rudolf Hess, Who Murdered My Father. Rudolf Hess and Rudolf Hess. I Regret Nothing. Wolf Rudiger Hess suffered a stroke in 2001, and not long after died in a hospital in Munich. Descendants of Martin Bormann, A Legacy in the Shadows. Truth be told, not all relatives of the Nazi official could come to terms with their deeds. One of them was Martin Bormann Jr., the son of Martin Bormann, of Hitler's closest aides, born in 1930. Martin Jr. was only a teenager when the war ended, which left his family facing a number of challenges in the final days of the war. Along with his mother Gerda and 8 other siblings, Martin fled to the South Tyrol region, trying to escape the advancing Allied forces. They were met by the local Nazi boss, who helped them hide in a small village near Bolzano. At the time, Mother Gerda was suffering from advanced ovarian cancer, which caused her immense pain. A local doctor diagnosed her condition and recommended immediate surgery. However, the operation was not successful, and Gerda's health continued to decline during this time. 2 British intelligence agents tracked the family down, but an army major who thought Gerda was a nice woman assured her that she and her children were not in danger of being sent to a concentration camp. Instead, Gerda was taken to a hospital for PS in Murano, where she received further medical care. Gerda died on March 23, 1946, just shy of her 37th birthday. Now orphans, Gerda's children were placed in the care of Reverend Theodor Schmitz, a German Army Catholic chaplain. They were left alone to deal with the difficult heritage their father left behind. Martin Jr. especially struggled to come to terms with his father's actions during the war. He loved his dad, but was also confronted with the reality of his role in the Nazi regime. This conflict shaped much of Martin Jr.'s adult life. In the early 1950s, Martin Jr. converted to Catholicism and made faith became a cornerstone of his identity. He found peace and purpose. In his new beliefs, he dedicated himself to working as a lay missionary, visiting schools, and speaking about the dangers of fascism and the importance of reconciliation. His faith offered him a way to deal with his father's legacy and find a new path in life. In 1958, he was ordained priest, and in 1961 he moved to Congo, where he worked as a missionary for 3 years. Despite his efforts to distance himself from his father's past, Martin Jr. could not entirely escape. He interacted with other children of Nazi leaders, sharing their experiences of stigma and societal judgment. These interactions highlighted the shared challenges they faced. Martin Jr. often had to explain his father's actions were his own, and justify he was a person with different beliefs and choices. Probably for that reason, Martin Jr. became a theology teacher, choosing a profession that allowed him to make a positive impact. On others, he worked hard to build a life that was separate from his father's actions. His dedication to education and his faith helped him navigate the challenge. As he wanted to be known for his own merits, not just as the son of a notorious Nazi leader. Martin Jr. married a fellow Catholic, and they had several children. He was determined to provide his children with an environment free from the shadows of the past. However, the weight of his father's legacy was always present. It influenced his parenting and personal relationships. A significant moment in Martin Jr.'s life was his visit to his father's grave, which was kept secret to prevent it from becoming a neo-Nazi pilgrimage site. Martin Jr. described the visit as a moment of profound reflection. He felt a mixture of sorrow and relief in his later years. Martin Jr. continued to reflect on his father's legacy. He remained active in his community, using his experiences to educate others about the horrors of the Third Reich. However, it turned out that Martin Jr. had demons of his own. In 2011, he was accused of raping a boy back in the 1960s. Other pupils also accused him of severe physical violence by that time. Martin Bormann Jr. was a silent old man, and no legal proceedings were conducted. Although the accuser was awarded compensation, Martin Jr. died 2 years later at the age of 83. Rudolf von Ribbentrop. The legacy of a diplomat's son. Rudolf von Ribbentrop was a person who suffered from being related to a high Nazi official. Even during the Nazi era, his father was the famous Joachim von Ribbentrop, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Nazi Germany. From 1938 to 1945, as a young man, Rudolf joined the SS and began his training at the SS Una School in Prague, an academy for training SS officers right from the start. He faced discrimination because of his father, despite being the best in his class. Rudolf was not promoted early because of his father's position. He was expected to behave modestly and not seek any special treatment. When in 1940 Nazis launched Ostern campaign, Rudolf was eager to fight and managed to join the campaign by convincing his father to allow it. He participated in battles where he experienced heavy enemy fire and saw his comrades die. Rudolf continued to face discrimination even after proving himself in battle. When he was ready to graduate from the military academy, he wanted to join the elite SS Panzer Division. However, due to an order from Himmler, he was sent to a less active combat group in Norway as a disciplinary measure. In 1941, Rudolf was severely wounded in Karelia, but returned to fight again. He joined a newly formed tank column under Sepp Dietrich's command. He fought bravely in many battles, including the Normandy campaign. In 1944, where he was again wounded. Despite his injuries, Rudolf refused to leave his men and continued to lead them. Rudolf von Ribbentrop was captured by the Americans south of the Danube. He was taken prisoner to avoid falling into Russian hands, which could have been fatal due to his name in the American camp. He faced harsh treatment. A young American guard robbed him, taking his cigarette case and decorations. However, when Rudolf accused the guard of theft, an older sergeant showed disgust at the guard's behavior and returned some of his belongings over time. Rudolf was transferred to different camps, where he experienced different conditions and treatments, all because of his name in Dachau. He discovered he was listed as a war criminal. For pillaging in Harcourt, he was offered help to escape by the German camp chief. But Rudolf decided to stay and face the charges. He believed running away would not help clear his name. Based on accusations, Rudolf was handed over to the French in January 1947 at Chur-Amidi prison. His poor treatment continued. He was strip-searched in front of female staff, and his belongings were again taken. He spent a freezing night in a cell with broken windows, after which he was transferred to a small cell with two other men sharing cramped and uncomfortable conditions one evening. French officers and their wives visited the cells, treating the prisoners like exhibits. Rudolf found this humiliating. Rudolf's situation improved slightly when he met Dr. Epting, who advised him to get a lawyer. Rudolf's mother contacted old family friends for help. Sir Alexander Walker of the Johnnie Walker Whiskey Company provided them money needed. The lawyer reassured him that the charges were weak, but still Rudolf had to endure a lasting and exhausting legal procedure. Despite the harsh conditions and slow legal process, Rudolf maintained his dignity. He faced each challenge with resilience. Whether it was dealing with cruel guards or fighting charges, this period tested his strength and patience, but he remained determined to clear his name. In July 1948, Rudolf was granted provisional release. He was sent to the Schultz family in G.A. Bisch Offheim. He felt a mix of relief and disbelief for the first time. In over 3 years he regained his freedom. Adjusting to post-war life was challenging. Rudolf had to rebuild his life from scratch, and his family name made finding work difficult. Many people were suspicious of him because of his father's past. Despite this, Rudolf remained determined to start anew, finding ways to support himself and his family. He decided to enter the family business founded by his mother's father. His mom, who was a partner in the company, nominated Rudolf as a managing partner, but the family of her sister opposed the proposal. Due to Rudolf's family background, they believed that having a partner bearing the name of Ribbentrop would affect the business. In the end, Rudolf settled with the family for compensation and moved to his friend's company, where he developed a successful career as a banker. Rudolf von Ribbentrop died in 2019 at the age of 98, as a man who managed to build a whole new life out of the ashes of his father's legacy. The Chirac brothers' lives entwined with the Third Reich. Living with the legacy of criminal parents was indeed a nightmare in post-war Germany. Aside from social ostracism, these individuals had to confront the fact that their loved ones committed some of the most gruesome atrocities humanity had ever seen. Each of them had to find their own way. How to cope with this? No different were the von Schirach brothers, sons of Baldur von Schirach, a prominent Nazi leader and head of the post-war lives of the Hitler Youth, were profoundly shaped by the need to reconcile with their father's actions and define their own identities. Baldur von Schirach, a prominent figure in the Nazi regime responsible for indoctrinating German youth, was tried at Nuremberg and sentenced to 20 years in prison for crimes against humanity. His career and trial cast a long shadow over his family, particularly his sons, who had to navigate life burdened by the stigma of their father's deeds. Each brother approached this legacy in his own way. Klaus von Schirach pursued a career in law, determined to demonstrate that he could lead a life independent of his father's infamy. For Klaus, professional success was a means to establish his own identity and earn respect in a society quick to judge the children of Nazi leaders. He strove to be recognized for his personal achievements rather than as the son of a notorious figure, yet he often confronted situations where he had to acknowledge or address his father's past, a constant reminder of the history he sought to move beyond. In contrast, Robert von Schirach chose a more private and low-profile life. Preferring to avoid public attention, he focused on his personal life and family as a way of coping with the heavy weight of his father's past. By keeping out of the spotlight, Robert sought to shield his loved ones from the direct consequences of their father's notoriety. Still, the shadow of Baldur von Schirach influenced both brothers' lives, shaping their decisions and paths in different ways. Despite their contrasting approaches, Klaus and Robert shared the same goal: finding a way to live while carrying the burden of their family history. A similar fate befell Nicholas and Norman Frank, sons of Hans Frank, Hitler's governor-general in occupied Poland. Hans Frank was responsible for a reign of terror and the deaths of millions, leaving an immense burden on his children. Nicholas Frank was profoundly affected, carrying lifelong guilt and shame associated with his family name. He confronted the reality of his father's crimes directly, refusing to shy away from the truth. Pursuing studies in German literature, sociology, and history, Nicholas became a journalist and frequently addressed the curse of being a Frank, reflecting on the tragic deaths of his siblings and the enormity of his father's atrocities. Over time, his embarrassment turned into deep hatred, and he wrestled with the fear of inheriting any of his father's traits, a struggle that shaped much of his adult life. Norman Frank, in contrast, followed a quieter path akin to Robert von Schirach. He distanced himself from public attention and lived without seeking recognition or commenting publicly on his father's actions. He neither defended nor condemned Hans Frank, instead choosing silence as a means to cope with the shame and burden of his family history. The experiences of Nicholas and Norman illustrate the diverse ways in which children of prominent Nazi figures confronted their fathers' legacies, revealing the complex emotions and challenges faced by families connected to the architects of Nazi atrocities.